A coin hits a table. The metal rings sharp. The tabletop is sticky with old oil. A little brass scale sits near a candle stub, and the needle can't stop twitching. The coin is legal, and the merchant still won't take it. This shouldn't be possible, yet it's how the system works. Because central banks weren't invented to make money nicer. They were invented because money stopped agreeing with itself, and a whole society started wasting time proving that a payment was real. This is the balance sheet of civilizations, and this episode is about where central banks actually come from. You live downstream of this, whether you know it or not. People think the birth of a central bank looks like a grand plan, a committee, a clean law, a clever new theory. But the birth usually looks like this table: a tired merchant, a line of customers, a coin that should settle the argument, and doesn't. So let's touch the object. Really touch it. He takes the coin, not gently but like it's suspicious. He rubs the rim with his thumb. He tilts it toward the candle. He taps it, listening for the right ring. He puts it on the scale and watches the needle wobble. Then he pushes it back. Not because he's cruel, not because he's dumb, because he's been burned before. This is where the story starts, and it's mundane on purpose. Money breaks first at the checkout counter. People think money fails with a bang, but it usually fails with little arguments. All day, every day. Picture a busy port. Different coins from different places. Some heavy, some worn smooth, some clipped so clean you'd almost miss it. The stamp says one thing, the metal inside says another. Every trade becomes a mini forensic exam. Every wage payment becomes a negotiation over trust. If you've ever watched two people argue over a bill that looks off, you already understand the emotional core of this. Now here's the first shock that matters. The simplest forms of money are the easiest to mess with. Coins feel honest because they're physical. But physical things can be shaved, clipped, swapped, or quietly debased until they're legal in public and questionable in practice. People think a state can solve this by declaring a standard, but a declaration doesn't stop your coin from being lighter. A law doesn't put missing silver back into the edge. So societies try a different move. They stop arguing about every coin by moving value into a place where the coin gets checked once and then disappears into paperwork. That sounds boring, but it's one of the most aggressive ideas a financial system can adopt, because once value becomes a line in a trusted book, the coin in your pocket becomes secondary. The physical money becomes the messy outer layer. The ledger becomes the real money for serious trade. And that leads us to the weird detail, early, because it changes how you hear everything else. In one famous trading city, the money inside the public bank became worth more than the money outside the bank. That shouldn't be possible. Money is money. A coin is a coin. This shouldn't be possible, yet it's how the system worked. Outside the bank, the city ran on mixed, worn, sometimes debased coin. You could spend it, but every big deal turned into a debate over what the coin was really worth. Inside the bank, merchants deposited coin and bullion. It got assessed under strict rules, and the bank credited them in a standardized ledger unit. So bank money became cleaner than the coin money. Cleaner means fewer arguments. Cleaner means faster settlement. Cleaner means less risk that you deliver your goods and get paid with disappointment. People think the first step toward central banking is paper money. But the first step is often something colder than paper, accounting that other people trust more than metal. Now let's not get carried away. A public exchange bank is not yet the full central bank you think of today. It doesn't have to set modern interest policy. It doesn't have to run a nation's entire money supply. It has a narrower, very practical job. Stop the argument. Make payments boring again. And once you do that, a new kind of power appears. Not political theater, plumbing power. Because if merchants and big institutions settle through the same ledger, the ledger becomes a meeting point for the whole system. It becomes a shared rail. It becomes infrastructure. Now you asked, was there a central bank in ancient Egypt, Greece? Here's the honest, mechanism-first answer. People think a powerful ancient state automatically has a central bank. But central is not the same as bank. Ancient Egypt had central storage and central control. Grain could function like money. Records could function like claims. Bureaucracy could coordinate production and taxation. But a central bank is a different creature. It's a coordinator for a dense credit network, a place that sits above private promises and keeps settlement from turning into chaos. In Egypt, the core coordination problem often looked like allocation. Who owes what to the state? Who receives rations? Who gets paid in kind? The state is the hub, yes, But it's not sitting above a web of private banks that need a shared settlement rail. Greece is closer to what you might imagine. A temple interior, cool stone, a heavy door, oil lamps, the quiet feeling that you shouldn't touch anything. Temples and other custodians could hold deposits, they could lend. Money changers could swap coin and keep ledgers. Trade existed, credit existed, trust existed. But the Greek world was fragmented. Many cities, many standards, many local arrangements. When something broke, it broke locally. A central bank, in the full sense, shows up when the system is so interconnected that a local break spreads like a stain. So the right way to say it is this. Ancient societies had money, storage, deposits, loans, and trust institutions. What they usually did not have, at least not in the mature form we mean, was a standing trust engine built specifically to coordinate settlement across a wide, interlinked financial web. That engine appears later, when trade and credit thicken into something that can seize up. To understand why, we have to stack the layers. This is the only model we're going to use, because it's the cleanest way to see the machine. At the bottom layer, you have ordinary life money. Pay your worker, pay your supplier, pay your taxes, buy food, boring daily stuff. Above that, you have record keepers and custodians, people and institutions that store value and track claims. A vault, a ledger, a deposit, a promise. Above that, you have networks, promises that move between cities, between firms, between institutions. The promise chain grows longer than any one person can personally verify. And above that, you get a coordination problem. When everyone depends on settlement happening on time, trust stops being a feeling and becomes infrastructure. People think trust is soft, but in a financial network, trust is mechanical, a yes or no on whether a payment clears. Now we can talk about the first central bank without turning it into trivia, because the word first depends on which layer you're pointing at. If you mean the earliest public bank that created trusted ledger money to fix coin confusion and settle payments, then you're in the world of early municipal exchange banks, where bank money can trade at a premium because it's cleaner than coin. If you mean the earliest surviving national institution explicitly described as a central bank, then you're in the world of Sweden's central bank. Born after a banking failure taught a harsh lesson about issuing promises without a solid base. If you mean the institution that became the template for tying public debt, banking privilege, and system stabilization together, then you're in the world of England's National Bank, built on a very blunt deal. Lend the government a big sum, and in return you get a privileged financial engine that becomes a national anchor. Notice what all of these have in common. They show up when money gets embarrassed, when the coin gets questioned, when the ledger gets disputed, when the network freezes. Now let's go back to that trading city and make the bank money premium feel real. A crowded office with a counter, ink-stained fingers, a thick ledger that thumps when it hits the desk, a clerk who has seen every trick. Someone slides a pouch of mixed coins forward, and the clerk doesn't look impressed. The clerk doesn't want your speech about how the coin is legal. He wants weight, purity, the rules. He makes an entry. Now you have a balance. And here's the second shock, still mundane. That balance can be valuable even if you never see your coin again. In other words, the value comes from acceptance in settlement, not from the romance of metal. If everyone you deal with agrees that a transfer on that ledger settles debts cleanly, your line in the book is money, in practice, even if it isn't a neat pile of coins on your table. People think money is valuable because it's redeemable into something physical. But at scale, money is valuable because other people are forced, by rules, by convenience, by habit, by contract, to accept it in settlement. Now we slide to the other half of the story, the state. Because a public exchange bank can fix merchant settlement. But a central bank, in the more recognizable sense, becomes inevitable when the state's funding problem meets the market's trust problem. People think the state is always the strongest player. But the state has a recurring weakness. It needs to spend before it can collect. Salaries, supplies, ships, fortifications, logistics. Those bills arrive on schedule. Taxes arrive later. And in a crisis, later is not good enough. So the state borrows. And the hard part is not borrowing once. The hard part is borrowing repeatedly without turning your promises into jokes. A smoky room, damp coats, a table with subscription papers, wax seals, quills that scratch like tiny knives. Someone reads terms out loud, not dramatically, just practically, like a landlord reading a lease. Here's your next touch the object moment. A subscription sheet, names, sums, signatures. a promise by the public to lend money to the government, and a promise by the government to pay interest. This is not an opinion. It's a contract you can hold in your hand. And once that contract exists at scale, it becomes a new kind of asset. The state's promise turns into something people can own, trade, and trust, if the system is built to keep the promise believable. Now the brutal math line. One strike, then we move on. 1.2 million pounds. That's why a government that couldn't wait for taxes learned to turn emergency spending into a structured public promise that the market could absorb. People think this is where banking becomes evil, but the real story is more boring and more powerful. It becomes architecture. A government needs funding. A public needs a place to put savings and a place to settle payments. A privileged bank sits in the middle, holding government debt, issuing trusted claims, and making the state's borrowing feel like a stable, tradable thing instead of a desperate shakedown. Now let's be careful with tone. This is not doom. It's not a morality play. It's a constraint problem. When a society gets complex enough, it needs a coordinator that can keep promises from turning into pile-ups. And once you build that coordinator, you also create a new kind of fragility. People start to rely on the coordinator being there. That's where central banking starts to feel like a lever. Not because someone wants a lever, because once everyone is standing on the same bridge, the bridge becomes the point of failure and the point of rescue. Now we can talk about Sweden without turning it into a trivia contest. Sweden's story is a clean example of how central banking is often born from a very embarrassing failure. Sweden had a money problem that was almost comical. Some coins were so heavy and awkward that they turned everyday payments into a physical chore. A bank introduced paper claims to make money easier to carry. At first, it felt like relief. Then the bank issued too many claims relative to what it could honor. Confidence cracked. People demanded conversion back into the real thing. And the system learned a harsh lesson. If you're going to issue claims that circulate like money, governance can't be casual. Out of that mess, a new institution is created, publicly governed, designed to be more durable. Sweden's central bank becomes the famous, oldest surviving one under many definitions. People think the lesson is, paper is dangerous. But the deeper lesson is, claims scale faster than trust. So if you scale claims, you need rules that scale with them. Now back to the merchant city and the ledger, because this is where a lot of people miss the most shocking move. Once the ledger becomes the trusted settlement rail, the system can start treating coin as the messy outer world. In some places, large transactions get pushed toward book transfer, not because the state is trying to be fancy, but because the state is trying to stop settlement from turning into a daily street fight. And over time, the bank money can become valuable for a reason that feels backwards. Not because you can always redeem it instantly into coin, but because other people need it to settle their own obligations. People think the highest form of money is the most tangible. But in a dense network, the highest form of money is the one that closes debts with the least drama. Now we're ready for the single paradox. Say it cleanly, then resolve it with plumbing. Here's the paradox. A central bank is created to make money more trustworthy, but its defining power is the ability to make money more flexible when everyone is scared. That sounds like a contradiction. If you can make money more flexible, doesn't that make it less trustworthy? This shouldn't be possible, yet it's how the system works. Here's the resolution. In a complex financial system, the main enemy isn't always fraud. A lot of the time, the main enemy is timing. Payments that are fundamentally sound can still fail if everyone reaches for cash at the same moment, and the private system can't meet the demand all at once. So, flexibility is not a permission slip to lie. It's controlled elasticity, rules and capacity that keep settlement moving so that a temporary panic doesn't smash the entire promise network. People think the opposite of trust is corruption, but in a tightly linked system, the opposite of trust is gridlock. Now, a bounded modern parallel, timeless, not news. In modern financial systems, most money is already ledger money. Your paycheck, your rent, your card swipe. These are claims moving on rails. When the rails are smooth, nobody thinks about them. When the rails jam, everybody suddenly cares about the institution that can restart motion. That's not a conspiracy, that's a design outcome. Once your society is built on promises that settle through shared infrastructure, the institution that stabilizes settlement becomes a central organ whether you like it or not. So, who was first? If you're being strict, you have to admit the word central bank is a label we apply after the fact. Early public banks were often municipal. They were built to solve coin confusion and settlement disputes. Some of them look central bankish because they created trusted ledger money and sat at a central point in commerce. Then some national institutions emerge after hard failures, and they're explicitly described as central banks under later definitions because they become durable public coordinators. And then you get the template institutions that link state borrowing, public subscription, and privileged banking into a national trust machine. People think this means central banking is a plot, but it's usually the opposite. It's what societies build when pretending the problem is simple stops working. Now bring it back to the table, bring it back to the coin, because this is the part that keeps the story mundane and real. The merchant looks at the line, he looks at the scale, he looks at the candle. He looks at you like you're asking him to gamble with his week. He doesn't want to be a philosopher. He wants to sell his goods and go home. So he chooses the money that ends the argument. That choice, repeated by thousands of merchants and households, pushes societies toward the same solution again and again. Trusted settlement rails, trusted ledger units, and eventually an institution that can keep the rails moving when confidence cracks. So, the next time you hear the words central bank, don't picture a throne, picture a counter, a ledger, a settlement deadline, a system that needs boring to survive. If you enjoyed this mechanism-first history, subscribe to The Balance Sheet of Civilizations, and leave a comment with the most ordinary moment you've ever had, where money suddenly felt, not like money, but like trust, something that could be there one minute and awkward the next.